The wind moved through the shattered tree-line like a whisper from another world, carrying with it the acrid scent of burned fuel, cordite, and churned earth, and Thomas Keating, 58 years old, hair streaked with the silver of too many winters, pressed his back against the rough bark of an oak that had somehow survived the bombardments, its trunk wide enough to swallow him from view if he kept still and pressed flat. His breath controlled to the slow rhythm he'd learned decades earlier. When stalking deer in the Pennsylvania woods, ahead, the low, grinding rumble of a tank's treads chewed through the mud, shaking the ground under his boots, and every few seconds the metallic squeal of its turret's slow rotation told him the enemy was scanning, hunting, maybe expecting movement but not seeing him because they weren't looking for someone like him, too old to be a front-line soldier. Assigned as a support scout to guide younger men through the broken forest after the collapse of their line 2 days ago, when the enemy's armored thrust had cut their battalion in two. He had been separated from his unit when the shelling began, fragments ripping the air and turning the ground into fountains of dirt, and now he found himself alone, without radio contact, no rifle, just a sidearm with 2 magazines, and the stubborn will of a man who'd survived too many things to give in now. His mind replaying the advice of his father from 50 years back. The woods have their own silence, son, and if you learn to live inside it, nothing will ever catch you. The tank ground closer, its tread snapping branches and churning the forest floor into a slurry, and through the gap between 2 splintered pines he caught a flash of dark green paint, the enemy's insignia smeared with mud, the snub nose of the barrel pushing past like the blind head of some great animal, and he knew that if it passed his position, the infantry following behind might sweep the area, which would mean the end. But the tree shielded him, its bark rough under his fingertips, the cold sinking into his bones through his damp jacket as he waited, listening, timing his breath with the mechanical groan of the vehicle, and he saw, just for a moment, the open hatch at the top, a crewman's head emerging, scanning with binoculars, his voice barking in a language Thomas didn't speak but understood well enough in tone. Frustration, maybe confusion at not finding what they expected. Thomas thought about the boys he'd been guiding, 2 barely out of high school, their faces pale in the dawnlight when he'd last seen them, and the thought steeled him. If the tank got through to the crossroads behind him, the enemy could fortify the position and cut off the town, and then nothing his side had left could take it back. The grinding roar shifted, the tank slowing as it reached a patch of thicker mud, and Thomas's eyes traced the path ahead, fallen logs, a slight dip in the ground that could slow it further. While his mind, that old mechanic's mind that had spent decades under the hoods of trucks, jeeps, and farm tractors, turned over possibilities. He could hear voices now, infantry nearby, boots sucking in the mud, their rifles slung low as they followed in the armored shadow, and he flattened himself further against the oak, heart steady despite the proximity of death, because fear had long ago been trained into something else, awareness, calculation, the patient waiting for the right moment. The infantry drew level, boots splashing in a shallow puddle barely 3 yards from him, but their eyes were forward, watching the tank's back like hounds on a leash, never thinking danger might crouch behind them. The tank lumbered past, close enough that Thomas could see the rivets along its flank, the heat shimmering from its exhaust, the smell of diesel strong enough to burn his nose, and he knew then, if he stayed low, moved with the rhythm of the machine's noise, he could shadow it, slip close to its blind spots, maybe even get aboard. It was a gamble, the kind that could end with him cut in half by machine gun fire, but it was better than letting the steel beast roll on to crush whatever resistance was left ahead. So, when the moment came, when the tank's bulk passed fully beyond the oak and the infantry's line of sight was blocked by its mass, he pushed off from the tree, boots sinking silently into the mud, and began to move in a half-crouch, matching his pace to the grinding treads, his eyes fixed on the ladder rungs welded to the rear plate, his body remembering every careful step from years of hunting, every silent shift of weight. The cold wind carried the tang of smoke from the battlefield behind him, and in that moment, every noise, every vibration seemed amplified. The rattle of loose gear inside the tank, the cough of the engine, the faint jingle of an infantryman's canteen. His hands were already slick with sweat despite the chill, the pistol in his belt, pressing against his side, but he didn't reach for it. Steel against steel would be faster, quieter, if he could get inside without alerting them all. Closer now, within arm's reach of the rear armor. He paused just long enough to make sure no infantry lagged behind, then gripped the cold metal rung, hoisting himself up with a grunt he smothered in his throat, his boots finding purchase on the muddy steel as he climbed. the engine's heat radiating through his gloves. The hatch above clanged as. The crewman ducked back inside, unaware of the shadow climbing toward him, and Thomas's mind sharpened, the noise of the war around him fading into the tunnel vision of the task. Get in, force them out, turn their own machine against them, because in a war where youth relied on speed and firepower, sometimes it took an old man's patience and guile to win the ground that mattered. ChatGPT. The heat inside the tank hit Thomas like a wave the moment he slid through the hatch, the air thick with the stench of diesel, gun oil, and the metallic tang of spent shell casings scattered on the floor, and for a second his eyes adjusted to the dim red glow of instrument panels and the narrow slit of daylight from the periscope. 3 men were inside, crammed into the armored belly like miners in a shaft, their voices sharp and hurried in a language he couldn't understand but whose urgency needed no translation. One was at the controls, hunched over the levers, the other manning the turret gun, swiveling it slowly in search of targets, the third shuffling ammunition into the breech with practiced speed, and none of them had yet turned to see him because the tank was loud, rattling with the churn of its treads over the uneven ground. Thomas's pistol was in his hand before the thought was fully formed, the weight of it familiar and steady, but he didn't fire. Killing them here might draw the infantry's attention too soon, and besides, there were other ways to make men abandon their post if you knew their machine better than they did. His gaze locked on the control panel, its array of levers and switches not so different from the tractors and bulldozers he'd worked on half his life, and in a quick, silent move, he stepped forward, his boots soft on the rubber matting, and yanked the engine's choke lever full back while simultaneously pulling the emergency fuel cut. 2 moves. So instinctive to an old mechanic they felt like muscle memory, but to the startled crew they were an abrupt catastrophe, the engine sputtering in protest before coughing violently and dying, the tank lurching to a halt with a shudder that threw the gunner against the side plating. The men shouted, scrambling to diagnose the problem, and that's when Thomas pressed the cold muzzle of his pistol against the loader's temple. His voice low and steady, the kind that didn't need translation to be understood. "Out now," he said, jerking his head toward the hatch, and though they didn't speak his language, the message was as clear as the steel against their skin. The loader froze, eyes wide, the driver turning in disbelief before Thomas motioned sharply with the pistol, backing toward the hatch to give them space but keeping his weapon trained on them, and one by one they obeyed, climbing out into the daylight with hands raised, their boots thudding onto the churned mud outside. Thomas followed them up, his senses prickling because at any moment the infantry could notice, and when his head cleared the hatch he saw them. 5 soldiers standing stunned, their rifles half raised, unsure whether to fire on their own tank or the man emerging from it. He didn't give them time to decide, shouting over the engine's silence in a voice that carried like a whip crack through the trees, "On the ground," and punctuating the order by firing a single shot into the mud beside the nearest soldier's boot, the sound snapping them out of hesitation and sending them sprawling in compliance. For a heartbeat, the clearing was still except for the creak of the tank's cooling engine, and then Thomas moved, vaulting fully out of the hatch, kicking the driver's hatch shut behind him and scanning the treeline for any other movement. His mind already racing to the next step because taking the tank was only the beginning. Holding it and using it to turn the tide would take more than one man. He knew his own people couldn't be far, maybe the remnants of his squad still circling back after the ambush, and if he could get the tank restarted and pointed toward the enemy's flank, they could reclaim the stretch of road the armor had been guarding, maybe even push them back toward the river. But there was a problem. He'd cut the fuel line, and fixing it under fire would be suicide unless he could buy time. So he dragged the captured crew and their escorting infantry into the shadow of the tank, ordering them down and binding their hands with a length of comms wire he ripped from the storage bin. His hands moving fast but sure, the way they had when lashing cargo in the back of his old farm truck. He kept an ear tuned to the forest, the faint pops of distant gunfire and the whisper of movement through wet leaves, and it struck him how similar the sounds were to the deer drives back home, men moving in lines, the forest alive with unseen motion, the difference being that here, the quarry was armed and just as intent on killing as surviving. Thomas crouched by the tank's side panel, his fingers tracing the access bolts, the weight of years guiding him as he found the section where the line could be rejoined without tools, a field repair that would hold just long enough to get him moving. The enemy prisoners watched him, one of them muttering something under his breath, and Thomas glanced up with a flat stare that shut him up cold, the unspoken truth hanging between them. This was no reckless young soldier they were dealing with, but a man who'd outlived 2 wars and wasn't planning on stopping here. The repair was quick, his calloused fingers tightening the clamp until the rubber bit into itself, and when he slid back into the driver's position, he felt the familiar hum of machinery under his palms, the vibration traveling through the steel into his bones like an old friend returning. The engine coughed, caught, and roared back to life, and over the noise he heard it, distant but growing, the ragged shouts of his own side, cutting through the trees from the east, the sound threading into his chest like a wire pulling him forward. There was still the matter of the enemy patrols likely circling back, and the open question of whether he could maneuver the tank into a position to trap them without being blown apart by their own armor. But for the first time since he'd been separated from his unit, Thomas felt the weight of the fight shift, the old, steady certainty in his gut telling him that this moment of stolen steel and engine thunder, was the key to taking back the land under his boots. The tank surged forward under Thomas's hands, its treads biting into the torn earth with a grinding determination that echoed the pounding in his chest. The world beyond the narrow viewing slit rushing past in a blur of shattered tree trunks, smoke drifting in ragged banners, and the occasional flash of muzzle fire from some unseen skirmish deeper in the woods. And as he coaxed the machine into motion he could feel the raw, animal power of it, every vibration thrumming up through the seat into his spine, a reminder that he now held in his grasp not just a weapon but a turning point, a steel fist that could punch a hole through the enemy's control of the road. Behind him, in the cramped belly of the tank, the bound enemy crew muttered and shifted, their boots scraping the metal floor, but he ignored them, focusing instead on the feel of the controls, the way the levers resisted and then yielded under his steady grip, the low growl of the engine blending with the distant thud of artillery somewhere to the west, and he thought of his squad, scattered and bloodied but not broken, men who had fought beside him through the choking mud of last winter's push and the blistering heat of the summer siege, men who would rally to the sound of their own armor rumbling back into the fight. The forest began to thin, giving way to a shallow slope where the smoke grew denser, and through the slit Thomas caught sight of movement. Figures in mismatched uniforms darting between the charred remains of farm buildings, rifles flashing as they fired toward an unseen target farther down the slope, and he realized with a surge of grim satisfaction that these were his people, pinned and trading shots, unaware that help was about to arrive in a form they could hardly believe. He angled the tank toward them, the steel giant grinding over a collapsed fence and sending splinters flying, and as he did he saw heads turn, faces twist in confusion, some ducking for cover, others staring in open disbelief at the enemy armor barreling toward them without firing. Thomas yanked open the hatch above him and rose halfway out, the wind tearing at his face, his voice bellowing over the engine's roar. "It's ours! Push forward!" And he saw the shift happen in an instant, their rifles swinging away from the tank toward the farmstead where the enemy infantry had dug in, their shouts carrying over the din like the snap of a taut rope. He dropped back inside, swung the turret toward the building where muzzle flashes bloomed, and without hesitation pressed the firing control, the cannon barking with a force that rattled his teeth, the recoil jolting through the entire frame as a shell screamed into the structure, blasting out the front wall in a spray of dust, timber, and shrapnel. The effect was immediate. Enemy silhouettes scattering, some stumbling from the smoke with hands raised, others dragging their wounded, their defense collapsing like a breached dam under the sudden shock of armor. Thomas kept the gun sweeping, not wasting shells but punctuating the advance with precise blasts, each one cutting off a pocket of resistance, until he saw his own infantry surging past, their boots pounding the churned mud, bayonets fixed, the ragged chorus of their war cries rising over the mechanical thunder. He felt the shift in the air, that subtle but unmistakable swing from desperation to dominance, and he pressed the advantage, rolling the tank forward until the enemy line broke entirely, their retreat a tangle of men diving into ditches, abandoning rifles, running for the thin cover of the tree-line to the west. There was no time to relish the victory. He knew from long years of fighting that broken lines could reform, that somewhere out there the enemy still had armor of their own, and that holding this reclaimed ground would require more than a single charge. But as the last of the resistance melted away, he climbed out of the hatch again, standing tall against the smoke-choked sky, and met the eyes of his comrades as they streamed past, some grinning in disbelief, others giving quick, sharp salutes, the unspoken message passing between them. The tide had turned, because one man had refused to be rooted to the ground and had taken the fight into the enemy's iron heart. He swung down from the tank, his boots hitting the earth with a solid thud, and moved to help secure the prisoners, his voice carrying the clipped authority of a man who knew there was still work to do, ordering patrols to sweep the flanks, setting a crew to fortify the roadblock with the tank positioned at its center as a steel sentinel, and all the while keeping his ears open for the telltale grind of distant treads, the warning that the enemy might yet counter. In the brief lull that followed, with the wind shifting to carry away some of the smoke and the sun breaking weakly through the haze, Thomas allowed himself a moment to breathe, to take in the stretch of road now under their control, the farmstead reduced to rubble but no longer bristling with enemy fire, the scattered bodies and abandoned weapons a grim ledger of the cost paid. He felt the ache in his shoulders, the familiar burn in his lungs from the adrenaline ebbing, but beneath it all was the quiet, unshakable knowledge that this ground was theirs again, won back not just by force of arms but by the stubborn, unyielding will to act when the moment came. And as he stood there, the tank's engine idling low beside him like some great beast waiting for its next command, he knew this was not the end of the fight but the beginning of the push that would carry them farther, step by step, until every inch of stolen land was reclaimed. ChatGPT